might be wondering why David Cameron's been slashing our armed forces, won't commit to 2%, is happy for us not to be able to defend our islands. I think Mr Juncker's given us the answer. We're going to do it at an EU level. We're going to have a European army. Now, when I raised this last year with the Deputy Prime Minister, Liberal Democrat Nick Clegg, he said it was a dangerous fantasy to even talk about an EU army. I hope every Liberal Democrat voter has heard Mr Verhofstadt today, the leader of the European Liberals, crying out for militarisation at an EU level. Of course, the truth is, it's already happening. We already have a European Defence Agency. We already have EU battle groups on active service all over the world. We already have an EU Navy active against the Somali pirates. And who can forget Eurocorps here in Strasbourg last year, virtually goose-stepping that ghastly flag round the courtyard outside. And of course the Lisbon Treaty, Article 28, provides for all of this. Tony Blair was right. He said the European Union is not a project about peace, it's a project about power. And I think Mr Juncker is trying to seize on an opportunity. We ourselves in the European Union provoked the conflict through our territorial expansionism in the Ukraine. We poked the Russian bear with a stick, and unsurprisingly, Putin reacted. But this now is to be used as an opportunity to build a European army. And when? Mr Verhofstadt, I know that by heckling you increase your hits on YouTube, because otherwise nobody in Europe wants to listen to you. And the President really ought to let me speak.
Just a moment, please. Just a moment.
Thank you.
Mr Farage, just a moment, please. Just a moment, please. Just a moment. Mr Verhofstadt, I turn to you. I have to ask you, please, to calm down. You may not like this speech, but we are Democrats and we listen to you too. So please do not interrupt.
Well, we certainly are Democrats, and we've never shouted you down, but you always try and shout us down. The point I was making is this: the opportunity is being seized, and Mr Juncker said we must convey to Russia that we are serious. Who do you think you are kidding, Mr Juncker? We do not want any part of an EU army, and I doubt the rest of the peoples of Europe do either. Thank you.
Well,
it's a bit of fun.
So, Herr Farage.
Thank you, Mr Farage. You've exhausted your speaking time. We extended it even. Now, Mr Verhofstadt, we've brought him back to reason. However, well, reason is a question of definition, I suppose. But anyway, I'm not necessarily saying that you're the expert when it comes to defining reason, but what I can tell you is that I asked Mr Verhofstadt to please listen to you. I hope he will continue to do so in the future. And to all of you, I would ask you also to make sure that you respect flags of whatever nature. Mr Sulic, I believe you had a question, is that right? Mr Farage, I take it? Is that right?
In fact, I would like to ask Mr. Farage, what do you think that we should have to do, Mr. Farage, when Russia, for example, is supporting with the most modern armaments, the separatists? Do you, as an European Union, have to do something to support Ukraine, to fight in the eastern Ukraine, or do you think that we should have to wait to fight on the western Ukraine for the stability of Europe? Don't you think that we together, we have to send a clear message of solidarity and unity of the European Union, considering this important subject? Thank you.
Speech. We, through our territorial ambitions, provoked the overthrow of an albeit corrupt but democratically elected leader in the Ukraine. We have provoked this crisis. Now the question you ask is, what do we do from here? I was in this chamber at the time when Libya was attacked. I heard the Liberals and the Greens screaming, frothing at the mouth, for us to bomb Libya, for us to become militarily involved, because we believed that would make things better. My view, sir, is if you look at Afghanistan, if you look at Iraq, if you look at Libya and you look at the attempt to back the rebels in Syria, many of whom have now morphed into ISIS, we see that our recent foreign military interventions have made things worse, not better.
Next question from Charles Hudson, please.
How can Britain face up to international challenges like Russian intervention in Crimea without the political weight which comes from being part of the European Union?
So political weight coming from the European Union. Nigel Farage.
By not becoming a political union with an expansionist foreign policy, with an aim to militarise as quickly as they can. Indeed, Baroness Cathy Ashton, the British Commissioner, is pushing very hard for a European Air Force and for a series of drones. And if you actually look at what's happened with the Ukraine, we've had a message that's been sent out now for 10 years, and this is not just the EU. Indeed, David Cameron, Nick Clegg, and I'm afraid Ed Miliband too. And the answer to Charles's question is, I don't want to be part of a European foreign policy.
The problem... But this is a dangerous fantasy. The idea that there's going to be a European Air Force, a European army, it is simply not true. The problem with people like Nigel Farage is they swing at windmills. They see conspiracies everywhere. I wouldn't be surprised if Nigel Farage soon tells us that the moon landing was a fake, that Barack Obama isn't American, that Elvis isn't dead. You know, it is not going to happen. Stop. He claimed last week that 485 million people were going to vacate the whole of the rest of the European continent and turn up in Britain, leaving no human habitation left in the rest of Europe. It's as silly as me saying that 5 million people living in Scotland might all move to Orpington next Tuesday. Right, it isn't going to happen.
Nigel Farage.
Nick, when are you going to start confronting a few simple truths and stop twisting the facts the way you did last week and you're doing this week? You're doing it again. You're saying that I said 485 million people would come to Britain. I didn't. I said they were able to. You came up with the most twisted trade figure I've ever heard. And last week you even said, you tried to tell the British people that only 7% of our national laws emanate in the European Union.
That is true.
I thought you believed in the European project. You and I both know that the whole point of the Constitution, which you supported, was to make the European Union an economic and a military superpower.
No.
And now you deny the fact they're trying to build a European Air Force.
It is a dangerous fantasy.
It's about... Well, you keep using this word fantasy.
Well, it is a
fantasy.
Why
it is just not true. I thought you were here to defend the European Union. No, they want an army, navy, and air force.
I also want to explain the truth and the reality.
But it's not
true, this fantasy world, which you keep talking about, which simply doesn't exist. It's saying that, I only said 485 people are entitled to move here. It's like me saying, well, 5 million Scottish people are entitled to move to Orpington. It's not going to happen.
Create a joint EU army growing stronger throughout the bloc. Finland and Germany say they're on board with the idea, which was put forward by the head of the European Commission on Sunday. Let's get more from our Berlin correspondent, Peter Oliver, just now. Hi, Peter. Good to see you. So what's the general feeling in Europe about creating its own army?
Well, in general, the feeling is rather much indifference. However, key players have said that they're on board with it. Finland have said they're on side with creating this, but most notably, Germany have said that they're on side with it. We heard from Jean-Claude Juncker saying that an EU army was the future. Well, that was pretty much backed up by the German Defense Ministry here in Berlin. The quote from them was that it was a vision whose time has come. It's not the first time, though, that the EU has broached this subject. The last time was back in 2013, and it was thoroughly scotched by the United Kingdom.
It isn't right for the European Union to have capabilities, armies, air forces, and the rest of it.
Of course, Eurosceptic groups in the EU are against this. We heard from them speaking about the subject of raising an EU army, and, well, they're not on board.
Army, their own or someone else's. Now Brussels wants its own army. Do you think this is a good idea?
Well, the EU Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker says he needs an army. However, Russia counters that by saying this is just the paranoia of the European Union, that Russia has no intention of going to war with anybody, and the idea of creating an EU army in order to counter Russia, well, it's simply ridiculous.
Peter Oliver in Berlin, thanks for that update. Russia dismisses its claims that it could be a threat to European security. Fears of possible aggression have been haunting Europe in recent months. Last October, Sweden spent more than €2 million and an entire week on a massive but fruitless hunt for a phantom Russian submarine. And last December, the UK also sounded the alarm over a suspected Russian sub off of Scotland. There's also been much concern in the skies too. In January, UK fighter jets were scrambled to intercept 2 Russian military jets above the English Channel. There was a similar incident off of Cornwall last month. Both times, Russian jets were not violating borders and were spotted in international airspace. Former Belgian MP Lode van Oos thinks the plan to create an EU army is not only aimed at Russia, but at the US as well.
You do not defend values with an army. Democracy or prosperity or social economy, those are all things that are not military. But the idea itself is not new at all. The context today, of course, is different. Actually, the European Union countries separately are already spending much more than, for example, the so-called opponent in this way, Russia. And they want to re-establish themselves militarily because economically they're losing ground. Within Europe, want to establish itself again as an entity next to the United States. I mean, this idea floated by Juncker now is not just aimed at Russia, it is aimed at the United States as well. No, we're not going to do as you tell us, you're an ally, but we define our policy ourselves.
Critics of the proposal say there's simply no need for an EU army when you have NATO, which is seen as the cornerstone of European defence. The bloc does have its own security and defence service, but its missions largely duplicate what NATO already does.
Following a United Nations request in 2008, NATO deployed a naval force to the region to escort ships that were carrying humanitarian aid to Somalia under the World Food Programme. Similar missions...
But the EU has also been doing just that. Its naval force was sent to the area at about the same time. The EU's first combat deployment to root out piracy off Somalia in 2008 is being seized on by Brussels critics for spending money on missions remarkably similar to NATO's. It's a view shared by Belgium's defence minister at the time.
We had a counter-piracy operation which was Atalanta, in fact an operation of the European Union as a whole, but at the same time we had the Operation Ocean Shield that was fostered by NATO. That's duplication, that's something that we should avoid.
Have been pretty unhappy with their NATO allies who've just kept cutting their defence spending. I'm pleased to say there's been a change around in the UK. We've now committed to spending 2%, which is considered to be a reasonable number. So, I mean, the problem with NATO is this. You know, you're absolutely right. It was a wonderful vehicle to keep peace in Europe for 60, 70 years. But NATO now does need to redefine itself. What's it for? You know, we don't have the Warsaw Pact. So I'm pro-NATO, I'm pro-cooperation, but it's not a bad thing if we reassess what it's for.
Well, when you ask what it's for, what about what Russia's doing right now in Ukraine? Isn't that what it's for?
Well, hang on. NATO and the European Union openly said they wanted the Ukraine to join their alliances. Putin saw that as a direct threat. So in terms of strategy, in terms of enlargement, NATO needs to sit down and re-examine what it's for.
If I might be so bold, Nigel Farage is espousing a certain policy that Donald Trump agrees with as well, which is that I do believe that you believe that there are spheres of interest, that Russia should have its way in its traditional sphere of interest, and that certainly Donald Trump views leaders like President Putin, even President Erdogan in Turkey, as strong and doing their thing, and we should not interfere in what they do, right? So it's this sort of authoritarian, autocratic bent towards letting other countries do what they think is best in their interest, and America should stay out of it while America, quote unquote, cleans up its own house. America is the leader of the free world. The leader of the free world, which wants to bring democracy, which wants to aid freedom, obviously, which wants to aid, morality and values, all the kinds of things that we've grown up with and we believe are the right way. America first cannot be America first if America is absent. And that, I think, is the takeaway from this.
No, that's fine, but let's be honest. Ukraine is a democracy. It's somewhat corrupt. It is a democracy. And the elected leader of the Ukraine was overthrown in a coup by people who wanted the Ukraine to move westwards and join NATO and join the EU. And all I'm saying is that we should not be... I'm not a Putin fan, but I don't think we should be encroaching on his space. That does not make sense.
Nigel, listen. Russia signed a deal with Britain, France, and those countries to make sure that Ukraine had territorial integrity in order for Ukraine to voluntarily give up its nuclear weapons. That was in Russia's interest. It was in the West's interest. And Russia violated that by violating, for the first time since World War II, an international border in Europe. This is the kind of thing. Obviously, NATO is not going to war there, Nigel. We know that.
No, but why,
we know that.
Why provoke? Why provoke? It's not necessary.
You can think that.
I do.
Think that, but that's
genuinely.
the Putin line.
Help us understand something for a second. Where is the provocation on the behalf of NATO of interceding in a sovereign Ukraine being invaded by Russia?
Well, the invasion took place after the overthrow of a democratically elected leader. All I'm saying is NATO a defensive organisation or is it an expansionist organisation? And that does need to be rethought.
Okay, then let's pick that apart. NATO is a defensive and, if necessary, an attack on one is an attack on all.
Article 51.
So Article 5 of NATO.
Yeah.
So NATO is created, and let's be very clear, because this is important for American foreign policy going forward, that this is the American-led security guarantee for all of Europe. And anything that messes with that and treats that as a purely dollars and cents transactional deal, which it was never envisaged as, and you're right, some countries have started to come forth with paying up the 2% of their GDP.
Which is right.
But to break up NATO is, and to say we're not coming to our allies' defense unless they pay us the money, is a complete break. And it retrenches America into a less safe America. So America's going to retrench, behind Fortress Atlantic and watch the rest of the world go to hell?
Well, I think we can all agree that 2016 has been a momentous, indeed historic year. And as it's Christmas, let's think of those events in terms of the three wise men bearing their gifts. First, we had the Brexit deliverance. Then we had the Trump triumph. And then thirdly, of course, the Italian rebellion. It's just that in this case, the gifts were all the same. Democracy and the rebirth of the nation state. And I really think you better listen, because I know in the past you've managed to ignore Danish, Dutch, Irish and French referendums, but this time it is for real. A democratic revolution has begun. And yet, when the 28 leaders of the EU countries meet tomorrow, on the agenda, I see no sign of humility. I see no understanding of what has happened at all. In fact, what I see is the implementation plan of the EU global strategy on security and defence. In simple English, EU militarisation, the building of a European army, and indeed Mr. Juncker used Donald Trump's magnificent victory to say, well, that means that NATO won't be here anymore. We have to do this ourselves, is what you said. And I think this is a huge and dangerous error. Trump is not a threat to NATO. He wants it to be redefined, and he wants the members to pay their way. It is Mr. Juncker who is a threat to NATO. And you can pretend today, if you like, that your military structure is going to run in parallel with NATO, but those two structures cannot run together without being in direct conflict with each other. It was Tony Blair that first really worried me about this project when he said the rationale for the EU today is not peace, it's about power. And already we've seen that power exercised in terms of foreign policy in the Ukraine, where we have wantonly provoked Russia into, and we've actually got rid of a democratically elected leader. You know, history is littered with conflicts caused by empires that seek to expand. And it's about time the British government actually stood up tomorrow and said, enough. This is madness. and we as an independent United Kingdom will act as the bridge between America and the nation states of Europe to make sure that NATO is secure. I also hope tomorrow that we see the British Prime Minister stop dithering on Brexit. It's been 6 months since we voted for our liberation, and at the minute we're being dictated to by courts and European commissioners and told what we can and cannot do. I hope we do that, but I suspect we won't, and I suspect the other 27 leaders will continue on the same course, and that's why you can all look forward to some even bigger dramatic shocks coming in 2017. It's going to be, for nation-state Democrats, a very happy New Year.
Herr Abgeordneter, es gibt eine Frage der Frau.
We've got a question from Mrs. Infeld for you. Mrs. Infeld.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just something that you said that I would like to ask your clarification. You say dictated by the courts. So do I understand that you now officially say that you no longer accept the independence of the courts, one of the pillars of democracy and the trias politica? A yes or no answer, please.
Well, Tony Blair did his absolute best to politicise a civil service that had been made neutral by Gladstone 140 years earlier. And yes, of course it's true. We have some people sitting in judgment who have actively been engaged in the process of European unity, and they, in those specific cases, should, I think, have absented themselves. But the real point I'm making is dithering. Had the new Prime Minister triggered Article 50 immediately, there'd be no court cases. We wouldn't have Monsieur Barnier talking down to us. We'd be getting on with doing the best we can under Article 50. Though I'm concerned, listening to your colleague, Mr. Verhofstadt, that once we trigger Article 50, it may become so unworkable that we simply have to say we're going goodbye.